Good morning, Colonel. The judge's voice sliced through the courtroom with such sharp precision that even the rhythm of the ceiling fans seemed to falter. For a heartbeat, the entire room was frozen in time. The court clerk didn't stir. The high-priced lawyers stood motionless, and my daughter Anna, sitting 3 rows behind me, looked on with tears already shimmering in her eyes. But it was my mother-in-law, Evelyn Carter, who truly captured the moment. Only seconds earlier, she had been wearing that polished, practiced country club smile, the one she reserved for moments when she was certain of her victory. But the instant the judge addressed me as Colonel, that smile fractured. Her face turned a ghostly pale beneath layers of expensive foundation. She stared at me as if a complete stranger had suddenly taken my place at the defense table. "Wait," she whispered, her voice trembling before rising in volume. "What did he say?" I kept my hands folded calmly on the table, my posture naturally reverting to the disciplined stiffness of my former life. 20 years in military courtrooms had taught me a vital lesson. The loudest person in the room usually has the weakest case, and Evelyn Carter had been loud for a very long time. The path to this courtroom had begun 3 months ago. I was standing in my kitchen, stirring a pot of chicken soup, when the certified letter arrived. It was a miserable afternoon in Norfolk, Virginia, the kind of cold, biting spring rain that settles into your marrow once you've crossed the threshold of 60. I remember it clearly because my knees were aching with a familiar, dull persistence. The return address on the envelope read Times Carter and Bellamy Legal Group. I knew instinctively that it wasn't a gesture of goodwill. Since my husband Frank had passed away the previous winter, every interaction with his family had devolved into a series of quiet, exhausting battles. At first, the jabs were small and petty. Evelyn criticized the flowers I chose for the funeral. She complained that I had sold Frank's fishing boat too hastily. She whispered to relatives that I was being erratic or emotional whenever I dared to disagree with her. But eventually, the veneer of politeness stripped away. Money has a cruel way of revealing the raw wood beneath the paint, especially old money. I opened the letter at the kitchen counter, the steam from the soup rising behind me. The legal jargon blurred before my eyes at first. Petition for estate review, allegations of undue influence, property dispute. I had to pull out a chair and sit down. Frank's lake house. That's what this was truly about. It wasn't about the grief of losing a son or a brother. It wasn't about family legacy or love. It was about the cedar cabin on a quiet stretch of Smith Mountain Lake where Frank and I had spent nearly every summer for 32 years. It wasn't a mansion. It was an old house with creaky floors, faded green shutters, and a dock that Frank had painstakingly rebuilt twice with his own hands. But it was the one place where my husband was truly at peace, especially toward the end. Cancer has a way of changing a man's soul. During the final months of his illness, the lake house was the only place he could find the solace needed to sleep. He would sit out on that dock, wrapped in a tattered old navy blanket, while I read beside him in the silence. Sometimes we wouldn't speak for hours. We didn't need to. Our silence was a language of its own. Now, Evelyn wanted it. According to the lawsuit, she intended to prove that I had manipulated her dying son into leaving the property to me. I laughed when I finished reading the letter. It wasn't because the situation was funny. It was because after 62 years on this earth, you realize that betrayal can become so predictable that it almost loses its power to shock you. Almost. People often assume that quiet women are weak. I learned that a long time ago, especially women of my generation. In America, you become invisible after a certain age. Cashiers stop making eye contact. Doctors start interrupting you. Young professionals call you sweetheart, while patronizingly explaining concepts you already understand better than they do. Most days, I didn't mind the invisibility. After retirement, I actually preferred it. But Evelyn Carter had mistaken my silence for helplessness. That was her first mistake. Her second was believing she actually knew me. "You should just settle, Mom," Anna told me that evening. We were sitting at my kitchen table while the rain tapped rhythmically against the glass. Anna looked utterly exhausted. Between her divorce, 2 teenagers, and a demanding job in hospital billing, life had worn her down. I don't want you going through this kind of stress, she said softly. Grandma Evelyn has the money, the lawyers, the connections. She has everything. I stirred my tea slowly, watching the amber liquid swirl. I know she does. She's telling everyone the house belongs in the Carter family bloodline, Anna added. I looked up, my gaze steady. Times was times Frank's family. Anna's eyes softened instantly. I know, Mom. I know. But the fear in her voice remained. I couldn't blame her. Most people had no idea what I did before I retired. Even my own daughter only knew the fragments I chose to share. Frank and I had agreed long ago to keep my military career private once we left that world behind. It wasn't a secret, per se, it was just separate. After years of navigating military tribunals, investigating overseas corruption, and witnessing enough human ugliness to last several lifetimes, I just wanted peace. I wanted gardens, well-worn books, and coffee on the porch. I wanted to be ordinary. And for a long time, I succeeded. At least until Evelyn Carter dragged me into the light. A week later, Evelyn invited the family to Sunday dinner. That alone was a warning sign. Evelyn never hosted unless there was an audience to perform for. Her home overlooked the Elizabeth River, all white columns and polished silverware. It was the kind of house where you never felt like you could truly exhale. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt the trap being set. Frank's younger brother, Richard, wouldn't meet my eyes. His wife, Sandra, offered me one of those tight, brittle smiles that wealthy people use when they are pretending to be civil. Dinner was a marathon of passive-aggressive comments disguised as concern. You must be so overwhelmed financially right now, Margaret, Evelyn said, elegantly slicing her roast. I'm managing, I replied. Well, legal matters can become prohibitively expensive very quickly. I took a calm sip of water. Across the table, Richard let out a short, mocking breath. You know, Margaret, Dad always intended for that property to stay in the Carter name. It's about heritage. I looked directly at him, my voice flat. Frank made his wishes very clear, Richard. Evelyn dabbed her lips with a linen napkin, her eyes cold. Well, that's what your lawyers will have to try and prove, won't they? My lawyers? I asked. It was an interesting choice of words, considering I hadn't hired any yet. I realized then that they truly believed I would panic. They expected me to sell quietly, disappear quietly, and lose quietly. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, a victor's glint in her eye. You know what your problem is, Margaret? You always acted like you were smarter than everyone else in the room. Sandra shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Anna stared down at her plate, but Evelyn wasn't finished. At the end of the day, you were just a housewife. The room went silent. Strangely, that comment cut deeper than the lawsuit itself. It wasn't about pride. It was because Frank had known exactly who I was. He respected the years I had given to service the sacrifices, the nightmares, and the burdens I still carried in silence. And now that he was gone, she felt she could erase that identity. I set my fork down with deliberate care. I'll see you in court, Evelyn. She smiled, a thin, cruel thing. Oh, Margaret, you're finished. That night, I sat alone on my porch, listening to the rumble of distant thunder over the water. I thought about Frank, about the oath I had taken decades ago, and about the young soldiers I had prosecuted and the innocent ones I had defended. I had spent 20 years mastering military law. 20 years learning that the truth matters far less than preparation. Evelyn Carter had no idea who she had decided to humiliate. For the first time in months, I opened the old leather case, tucked away in the back of my closet. Inside were my military records, my commission papers, and the Silver Eagle insignia I hadn't touched since the day I retired. I held the cold metal in my palm for a long time. Then I smiled to myself. It wasn't a smile of anger or a desire for revenge. It was the smile of certainty. For the first time since Frank died, I finally remembered exactly who I was. The morning of the hearing, I woke before the sun rose. That used to happen before every major tribunal overseas. I didn't need an alarm. My body simply remembered the weight of impending pressure before my mind could even catch up. I sat at my kitchen table in the dark, warming my hands on a cup of black coffee. Outside, Norfolk was still. The streetlights reflected off the damp pavement. At 62, silence feels different than it does when you're young. In youth, silence feels like an empty space that needs to be filled. When you're older, it feels like something you've earned. I stared at the folder sitting beside my mug. It was plain brown leather, no expensive briefcase, no dramatic stacks of paperwork, just enough. That was another lesson from military law. The people most desperate to appear powerful usually carry the largest binders. I dressed simply that morning. Gray slacks, a navy blouse, and a dark wool coat. Nothing flashy, nothing that would invite a second look. I tied my silver hair back neatly and checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. I looked like a widow, a grandmother, a woman you would overlook in a grocery store. Perfect. The downtown courthouse was a classic American monument, cold stone, towering windows, and the hum of metal detectors at the entrance. I climbed the steps slowly, favoring my aching knees. Halfway up, I heard a familiar voice. "Mom?" Anna hurried toward me, clutching 2 coffees and looking frantic. "Are you okay?" she asked, searching my face. "I'm breathing." That's not an answer. I gave her a faint smile. That's the only answer people our age can guarantee, honey. She laughed despite her nerves. That's the thing about daughters. Even when they are grown, they still need their mothers to sound steady. Anna glanced toward the entrance. They're already inside. Of course they were. People like Evelyn always arrive early when they believe a public victory awaits them. "Mom," Anna lowered her voice. "Last chance to settle. We could talk to them. You could lose everything if this goes wrong." I looked at her, my expression softening. "You know what your father used to hate most, Anna?" "What? Bullies?" I nodded. Frank hated arrogance in every form, especially wealthy people who used their influence like a weapon. Maybe that's why we understood each other so well. He came from privilege, but he never worshipped it. That quality skipped a generation with Evelyn. The moment we stepped into the lobby, I spotted them. Evelyn was standing near the security checkpoint in a cream-colored designer suit, wearing pearls large enough to pay off a mortgage. Richard stood beside her in a tailored charcoal suit, wearing a mask of practiced solemnity. They were surrounded by 3 lawyers, all of them expensive, polished, and lugging thick trial binders for a property dispute that should have been a simple matter of a will. Evelyn saw me immediately. That hollow smile returned. "Well," she said, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. Margaret actually showed up. I kept walking, my expression neutral. One of her attorneys glanced at me, his eyes scanning the area for my legal counsel. When he realized I was alone, his expression shifted to something resembling pity mixed with predatory instinct. Predators always recognize isolation. "You don't have a lawyer?" Richard asked, sounding almost disappointed. "I didn't say that." Evelyn let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Oh, sweetheart, this isn't small claims court. You're out of your depth." Anna stiffened beside me, but I touched her arm. "It's fine," I said quietly. Evelyn stepped closer, the scent of her sharp, expensive perfume hitting me first. "You really should have accepted the settlement, Margaret." I met her eyes with a level gaze that had once made hardened officers blink. "And you should have respected your son's final wishes." Something hardened in her face instantly. "There it is," she whispered. "That arrogance." "No," I replied calmly. "That's called grief." For a split second, I saw a flicker of genuine discomfort cross her face. Then, it vanished behind the mask of wealth. "You're finished," she snapped. I didn't answer. Sometimes, silence unsettles cruel people far more than anger ever could. The courtroom was smaller than I had anticipated. It featured old wooden benches, a dusty American flag near the bench, and the faint, lingering scent of old paper. I sat alone at the defense table. Across the aisle, Evelyn's legal team began spreading out their materials like they were preparing for a high-stakes corporate merger. The gallery began to fill. People stared not openly, but with that subtle curiosity people have for a lopsided fight. An older woman in the back row gave me a sympathetic look. She likely assumed I couldn't afford representation. I didn't mind. Underestimation is an incredible gift if you know how to use it. Anna squeezed my shoulder before taking her seat behind me. Are you sure you're okay? I nodded once. Truthfully, I felt calmer than I had in months. Courtrooms always made sense to me. Unlike family dynamics, which are messy and emotional, legal battles are procedural. Procedures can be managed. Emotions are the dangerous variables. The hearing began promptly at 9. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Harold Bennett entered. He was in his late 60s, with the disciplined posture of a man who had seen a lot of history. He carried a thick case file under one arm and possessed sharp, discerning eyes. The moment I saw him, I recognized him. Not from a social circle, but from a professional life long past. We had crossed paths years ago, during a military tribunal in Germany, back when my hair was still dark, and my knees didn't protest the rain. He looked older now. I suppose I did too. He scanned the courtroom casually, his eyes moving over the lawyers and the family. Then, his gaze landed on me. He stopped. A strange, heavy silence followed, small, but noticeable to anyone paying attention. I watched recognition settle across his features, followed by a flash of surprise, and then, a deep, unmistakable respect. Evelyn's lead attorney stood up, eager to begin his performance. Your Honor, this is a tragic but unfortunately common case involving undue influence over a terminally ill man. I almost smiled. There it was, the narrative. The poor, wealthy family being manipulated by the emotionally unstable widow. It was a classic play. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes, using carefully curated language and emotionally charged phrasing. At one point, he referred to me as financially dependent, a term that stung slightly. I didn't react, but I noted it. Then came the implication that hurt the most, that I had isolated Frank during the final stages of his illness. Anna shifted angrily behind me. We both knew the truth. Frank had asked for distance not from love, but from the noise. Cancer makes you tired, and Evelyn Carter never knew when to stop talking. By the time the attorney finished, the room practically expected me to burst into tears or plead for mercy. Instead, I simply organized my few papers in silence. Judge Bennett turned his attention to me. Mrs. Hayes, he said, will you be representing yourself today? Yes, Your Honor. Evelyn's smile was practically radiant. I could feel her satisfaction radiating from across the room. The judge studied me for a long moment, his expression shifting, the recognition in his eyes deepened, and he sat a little straighter in his chair. The room fell unnervingly still. Then, Judge Bennett gave me a small, respectful nod. Good morning, Colonel. The silence that followed was absolute. The air seemed to leave the room. Evelyn's smile vanished instantly. Richard blinked in confusion. One of the high-priced attorneys actually dropped his pen. Behind me, I heard Anna's whispered breath. What? The judge continued, his voice calm and steady. It has been a long time, Colonel. I nodded once, my voice clear. Yes, sir. It has. Evelyn stared at me as if the floor were about to swallow her whole. Colonel? She repeated, her voice weak and reedy. For 20 years, I had sat in military courtrooms where reputations, careers, and entire lives depended on precision. Now, I watched the realization spread through the room, one face at a time. The opposing attorney cleared his throat awkwardly. Your Honor, I wasn't aware that Mrs. Hayes had legal experience. Judge Bennett looked at him with a dry, knowing expression. That would be a significant understatement. I folded my hands calmly on the table. For the first time since Frank died, I saw real, unadulterated fear enter Evelyn Carter's eyes. No one moved for several seconds. You could practically hear the gears turning in their heads. The court reporter's hands hovered over the keys. Evelyn looked more offended than shocked, as if the universe had violated a contract she assumed she controlled. Colonel? She whispered again. Judge Bennett looked mildly surprised by her confusion. Yes, he said. Retired Colonel Margaret Hayes. I believe she served in the Judge Advocate General's Corps for over 2 decades. One of the younger attorneys swallowed hard. The lead lawyer suddenly looked much more cautious. The world of senior military prosecutors is a small one. Names are remembered. Evelyn turned to me, her voice trembling with what looked like a sense of betrayal. You were a lawyer? I turned toward her slowly. Yes, but you said you were retired. I am. No, she snapped, visibly rattled. You said you worked for the government. I did. The judge cleared his throat sharply. Mrs. Carter, please direct your comments through your counsel. Evelyn sank back into her chair, but the damage was done. Her certainty had evaporated. Her attorney stood up again, though his posture had lost its theatrical flair. Your Honor, he said carefully, while Mrs. Hayes's military background is impressive, it is irrelevant to the property dispute currently before this court. Technically, he was right. My rank didn't change the law, but credibility is the currency of the courtroom. Judge Bennett nodded. Proceed. The attorney tried to regain his rhythm, but he sounded like a man walking through a dark room full of glass. He attempted once more to paint me as manipulative, but I stood up to interrupt him politely. Your Honor, may I respond directly to that point? You may, Colonel. I stood slowly, feeling the slight protest in my joints. I looked at the attorney. You stated that I isolated my husband. Did you personally interview his oncology nurses? The attorney hesitated. No. Did you review the hospice visitation logs? No. Did you speak with Dr. Levon regarding the medical recommendations for my husband's rest? No. I nodded and sat back down. Thank you. That is all. It was simple, surgical. The courtroom now understood something Evelyn never had. I knew exactly how this game was played. Most people think military prosecutors spend their time shouting like they do on television. The truth is much colder. The best of us never raise our voices. We just ask the small, quiet questions that leave you with nowhere to hide. As the hearing progressed, the judge allowed a preliminary review of evidence. Evelyn's team submitted financial statements and witness declarations, all aimed at the same goal. I waited until they were finished, then opened my folder. Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit D. The bailiff took the copies. Judge Bennett read the first page, then the second. He slowly removed his glasses. Interesting. Very interesting. Evelyn shifted in her seat, leaning toward her lawyer. What is it? She hissed. No one answered her. Finally, the lead attorney cleared his throat. Where exactly did you obtain this document, Mrs. Colonel? From my husband, I said. The document was a notarized estate protection letter, signed 8 months before Frank's death. In it, Frank stated explicitly that the lake house belonged solely to me. He added that any attempt by his family to contest the ownership was against his express wishes. But the dagger was the final sentence. I am making this statement voluntarily, without coercion or influence, specifically to preempt the predictable actions of my mother, Evelyn Carter. The attorney's face tightened. Evelyn looked stunned. That's impossible, she whispered. No, I said softly. It's just inconvenient. Behind me, Anna had her hand over her mouth. I hadn't shown her the document. Not because I didn't trust her, but because 20 years in prosecution taught me to trust timing over emotion. The atmosphere in the room shifted. People weren't looking at Evelyn as a grieving mother anymore. They were looking at her as a woman who had ignored her son's dying wishes for the sake of a piece of land. The lead attorney requested a short recess. Judge Bennett granted 10 minutes. The moment the judge left the bench, Evelyn turned on me, her face contorted with rage. You hid this. You're a manipulative little... Mrs. Carter. Judge Bennett's voice boomed from the doorway, sharp and warning. Evelyn went silent, but her composure was shattered. Richard approached me, his voice low. Margaret, maybe we should discuss some settlement options. There's no need for this to get uglier. I looked at him, seeing the cowardice Frank had always described. Your brother already made his decision, Richard. During the recess, Anna sat next to me, her hand trembling. Mom, you were really a colonel? You prosecuted military crimes? Yes. For nearly 20 years, she stared at me as if she were seeing me for the first time. I feel like I don't even know you. That hurt. I touched her hand. You know exactly who I am, Anna. I just didn't want that life to be my whole identity. I wanted ordinary mornings and ordinary love. I was tired of courtrooms deciding people's futures. When court resumed, the tension was palpable. Evelyn's lawyers were now on the defensive. Judge Bennett reviewed the additional filings before looking back at me. Colonel Hayes, do you possess any additional evidence relevant to this dispute? I paused, then opened my folder one last time. Yes, Your Honor, I do. Evelyn's face went bloodless. She realized, far too late, that I hadn't come here to defend myself. I had come to finish this. You learn a lot about people when fear enters the room. Some go quiet, some get angry, and some, like Evelyn Carter, become reckless. After lunch, the Queen had lost her crown. Her lawyers were no longer smiling, and Richard was fidgeting with his tie. Proceed, Colonel, the judge said. I walked toward the evidence table, the hardwood floors creaking under my feet. I handed the final copies to the bailiff. Exhibit F, I said calmly. The younger attorney scanned the page first. I watched for the exact moment his expression changed, that telltale tightening of the eyes. The moment he realized their case wasn't just losing, it was collapsing. What is it? Evelyn demanded again. Her lawyer didn't answer. He couldn't. Good lawyers never answer panicked clients too quickly. They let the silence simmer, letting the weight of the situation sink in. Finally, the older attorney leaned toward Evelyn, his voice dropping an octave. It's correspondence from your son. The color drained from her face again, her skin turning the shade of parchment. Frank had been a prolific writer during his illness. He had penned dozens of letters. Some were deeply personal, some strictly practical, and a few were so painfully honest they felt like open wounds. Judge Bennett read the document in a heavy, contemplative silence for nearly a minute before finally looking up over his spectacles. This appears to be an email exchange between the deceased and Mrs. Carter. Yes, Your Honor, I replied. The judge continued reading, his expression unreadable. Then, he looked directly at Evelyn. Mrs. Carter, did you pressure your son to alter his estate arrangements during his chemotherapy treatments? Evelyn straightened her spine immediately, a flicker of her old defiance returning. Absolutely not. The lie came too quickly, it was too polished, too practiced. I had heard thousands of lies like it during my career. People often believe that a lie sounds more convincing when spoken with unwavering confidence, but in a courtroom, it usually just sounds rehearsed. The judge glanced toward me. Colonel Hayes. I opened another document with measured calm. Page 3. Your Honor. He flipped the pages, then stopped. The courtroom grew still once more, the air thick with anticipation. There it was, Frank's own words, preserved in digital ink. Mom, if you bring up the lake house one more time, I will ask the hospital staff to restrict your visitation. Maggie has cared for me every single day, while you have done nothing but talk about property. Behind me, I heard Anna gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard closed his eyes, looking suddenly very old. And Evelyn? She looked furious, not ashamed, not heartbroken, just pure, cold fury. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. I wish I could say that revenge felt satisfying. Movies always portray it that way. The dramatic courtroom victory, the villain collapsing under the weight of the truth. But real life feels much heavier, especially at my age, standing there and having to read my dead husband's private pain aloud for the world to hear. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. None of this should have ever happened. Frank deserved peace in his final days. Instead, he spent his last months protecting me from his own flesh and blood. That truth hurt more than any insult Evelyn had ever hurled my way. The older attorney requested a brief recess to speak privately with his client. Judge Bennett granted 5 minutes. The moment they stepped aside near the courtroom wall, Evelyn's voice exploded in a series of harsh whispers. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught the jagged edges of the conversation. How was I supposed to know she kept everything? She tricked us. No, the attorney interrupted, his voice sharp enough for half the courtroom to hear. You failed to disclose relevant information to your counsel. Ah, there it was. The fracture. Good attorneys hate surprises, and Evelyn clearly hadn't told them the full story. Richard rubbed his forehead anxiously, his voice trembling. You said those emails were deleted. Evelyn snapped toward him like a cornered animal. Well, apparently they weren't. The younger attorney looked genuinely uncomfortable now, likely realizing he had tied his professional reputation to a client who practiced selective honesty. Military court had taught me a vital lesson years ago. People rarely destroy themselves all at once. They unravel thread by thread. And usually, it's ego that pulls the first string. Anna moved beside me during the recess. This time, her eyes looked different. The confusion was gone, replaced by a fierce, quiet pride. Dad protected you, she whispered. I nodded softly, my throat tight. He tried. You protected him too. That nearly broke me. Because nobody had said those words out loud since the day Frank died. For months, Evelyn had painted me as a manipulative burden, a stranger hanging around her dying son. But caregiving changes people, especially older couples. After enough years together, love stops looking like a movie. It becomes practical. It becomes quiet. You memorize medication schedules. You learn how to lift someone gently when they're too weak to stand. You sit awake in the dark, listening to the rhythm of their breathing. That was marriage at the end. Not romance, but duty, a sacred, exhausting duty. And I would have carried it forever if I could have kept him alive. When the proceedings resumed, Judge Bennett's tone was noticeably firmer. Mrs. Carter, the court is becoming increasingly concerned regarding the validity of several claims made in this petition. Evelyn's attorney immediately tried to pivot. Your Honor, perhaps we should discuss the possibility of mediation. No, Evelyn interrupted sharply. The attorney froze. I almost sighed. Pride makes even intelligent people behave like fools. Judge Bennett looked entirely unimpressed. Mrs. Carter, I strongly advise you to listen to your counsel. She manipulated my son, Evelyn cried out, pointing a trembling finger at me. I remained calm, my voice steady. Your son begged you to stop, Evelyn. That landed harder than any shouting match ever could. Evelyn stared at me with open hatred. You think you're better than us just because of your military title? No, I answered quietly. I think your son deserved dignity while he was dying. Silence. Pure, absolute silence. Even the courtroom clerk stopped shuffling papers. Evelyn's eyes suddenly filled with water. Not from grief, but from the raw sting of public humiliation. For the first time in her life, someone was forcing her to face the consequences of her actions in the light of day, and she didn't know how to survive it. Then came the final blow. I opened the last section of my folder. Your Honor, I would also like to submit audio documentation relevant to the coercion attempts regarding the estate modification. The older attorney actually closed his eyes. He knew it was over. Judge Bennett raised an eyebrow. Audio documentation? Yes, sir. Evelyn looked confused, then terrified. She finally remembered the phone calls. Months earlier, she had called constantly, demanding updates and pressuring Frank about the property, even accusing me of controlling his access to the family. Eventually, Frank had asked me to record the calls not for revenge, but for his own protection. The bailiff connected the recording device, and then Evelyn's voice filled the room cold, sharp, and unmistakable. If Margaret really loved you, she'd put the lake house back in the Carter family name before you die. Anna gasped behind me. Richard stared at the floor. The recording continued. You're sick, Frank. You're not thinking clearly anymore. Then came Frank's voice, exhausted, weak, but resolute. Mom, stop. That one sentence changed the energy of the entire room. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was just the sound of a dying man begging for peace. Judge Bennett stopped the recording after a few more seconds. Nobody spoke. Evelyn sat frozen. For the first time all day, she looked old. Not powerful, not elegant, just a frail, bitter woman. The judge removed his glasses slowly. Mrs. Carter, this court now has serious concerns regarding potential fraudulent conduct and coercive interference involving estate matters. The older attorney whispered something urgent to Evelyn, probably another plea for a settlement, but she just stared at me, looking as if she still couldn't understand how the quiet widow she had mocked had become the most dangerous person in the room. If further evidence supports these findings, Judge Bennett continued, criminal fraud exposure may become a consideration, and just like that, the Carter family empire began to collapse in public. By the fourth day of hearings, the entire atmosphere had shifted. When this started, people treated me like a grieving widow trying to cling to something she couldn't afford. Now, the courthouse staff greeted me with respect every morning. The bailiff held the doors open for Anna, and Evelyn? She had stopped making eye contact with anyone. It's funny how quickly power shifts once the truth enters the room. Outside the courthouse, I noticed reporters gathering. It wasn't national news, just local Norfolk media, a small-town legal drama involving a prominent family and allegations of coercion. The kind of story retirees discuss over coffee. I hated the attention. I always had. My time in the military had cured me of any desire for public admiration. Once you've watched young soldiers receive folded flags instead of retirement parties, public recognition starts to feel very small. Still, I understood why they were there. The Carter name carried weight in Virginia social circles, and watching a wealthy family tear itself apart in court always attracts curiosity, especially when the helpless widow turns out to be a retired military prosecutor. That morning, Anna walked beside me toward the courtroom. "I still can't believe you never told me all this," she said softly. "I told you enough. I told you I worked in legal affairs." I smiled faintly. Technically, it wasn't a lie. She laughed under her breath, then her expression softened. "Dad knew everything, didn't he?" "Yes, and he was happy to keep it private. He preferred it that way." Frank used to joke that my career scared his golf buddies, especially after they'd had too much bourbon and started arguing politics. Once, years ago, one of them asked what kind of law I practiced. Frank had answered calmly, "The kind where people go to prison." The poor man nearly dropped his hamburger. Even now, the memory made me smile. Anna glanced at me. "You miss him a lot today." "Yes. Some days grief sits quietly beside you. Other days, it walks directly behind your ribs." Inside the courtroom, Evelyn looked diminished. That was the only word for it. She looked smaller, not physically, but spiritually. Her expensive suit still fit. Her pearls still gleamed, but her confidence had abandoned her. Richard looked exhausted, too. The cracks were spreading through the family far beyond the courtroom walls. Money does that. Once the fight for an inheritance begins, old resentments crawl out of the dark places where they've been hidden for decades. Judge Bennett entered at 9 sharp. The proceedings began with yet another settlement discussion requested by Evelyn's attorneys. This time, their tone was desperate. "My client wishes to explore resolution options regarding the lake property," the attorney began. Judge Bennett looked toward me. "Colonel Hayes?" I stood up, my movements deliberate. "No, Your Honor." Evelyn turned toward me, her eyes wide. "What do you mean, no?" I said steadily, "your son already resolved this matter before he died. There is still room for compromise," she snapped. "No," I said quietly. "There isn't. This was never about the money anymore. It was about the truth. After months of being painted as a manipulative opportunist, I needed the truth spoken clearly in public, not buried behind a private agreement. At my age, you realize that your reputation is part of your legacy. Evelyn had tried to destroy mine while I was still burying my husband. The hearing moved toward final testimony. Evelyn's attorneys had abandoned their aggressive tactics. It was too dangerous now. Instead, they tried to frame her as a grieving mother, emotionally overwhelmed by loss. Part of that was likely true. Grief can twist people into ugly shapes. But grief is never an excuse for cruelty. Judge Bennett finally looked at me. Colonel Hayes, would you like to make a final statement before the court rules? I stood slowly. The room became pin-drop quiet. I looked at the judge, then briefly at Evelyn, then at the polished wood of the floor. I realized then that I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired, sad, and disappointed. But the anger had evaporated. My husband spent the final year of his life in pain. I began softly. Cancer strips dignity away piece by piece. People who haven't witnessed it up close don't truly understand that. Anna wiped away a tear. Frank lost his weight, his strength, his sleep, and his independence. But, I paused, he never lost his clarity. Evelyn looked down at her hands. He knew exactly what he wanted. Peace, quiet, time at the lake, and freedom from pressure. I looked at her. The lake house was never about money to me. Frank rebuilt that dock himself after the hurricane. He taught our grandson to fish there. He spread his father's ashes near those trees. It was the last place my husband felt like himself. The reporters had stopped writing. The room was breathless. I did not spend 32 years loving a man just to steal from him when he became weak. Evelyn closed her eyes. For the first time, she looked truly ashamed, not because she had been caught, but because the weight of her own actions had finally settled on her. Judge Bennett thanked me and reviewed the final documents. At my age, waiting feels different. You become acutely aware of how much of life happens in the pauses in hospital waiting rooms, in funeral homes, in the silence after a midnight phone call. Finally, he spoke. This court finds overwhelming evidence supporting the validity of the deceased's estate intentions. The petition contesting ownership of the lake property is denied in full. Anna let out a sob of relief. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice sharpening, the court finds credible evidence of coercive conduct toward the deceased during periods of medical vulnerability. While we will not pursue immediate criminal referral at this stage, let me be clear. What occurred here was deeply inappropriate. Then came the final line. The property remained solely under the ownership of Colonel Margaret Hayes. It was over. Outside, I ignored the reporters. Anna hugged me tightly on the courthouse steps. You won, Mom, she whispered. No, I said softly. Your father won. Across the plaza, I saw Evelyn standing alone near the curb. Her attorneys were already walking toward their cars. No family gathered around her. No friends came to comfort her. For a moment, I almost kept walking. Then, I saw her hands trembling. Despite everything, I walked over. She looked startled. Margaret. Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. You could still report me. You'd win. I looked up at the cloudy Virginia sky. Because after decades of prosecuting broken people, I understand something you don't, Evelyn. Punishment changes behavior. But mercy reveals character. I looked her in the eye. You've already lost the only thing that actually mattered. Then, I walked away. 3 months later, the lake house finally felt quiet again. There is a difference between empty and quiet. Empty feels abandoned. Quiet feels healed. I stood on the dock one October morning with a cup of coffee. Fog drifted across Smith Mountain Lake in slow, silver waves. The air smelled of pine and cold water. Frank loved mornings like this. He used to say the lake looked honest before the sun came up. No boats, no noise, just stillness. At 62, I've started appreciating stillness more than victory. People began treating me differently after the trial. Neighbors who barely waved before now wanted to talk. Former friends of the Carters sent awkward apology letters. Even strangers at the grocery store recognized me. Colonel Hayes, they'd say. It's funny how a title changes people. I disliked most of it. I hadn't become stronger because of the trial. I had simply stopped hiding. Anna visited every weekend now with the grandchildren. The trial had changed our relationship too. For years, she saw me only as mom reliable, quiet, predictable. Now, she looked at me with curiosity. One Saturday, we were on the porch wrapping Christmas decorations. You know, Anna said, I think I understand now. Understand what? Why you stayed so calm all those years. I smiled. I wasn't always calm. You looked calm. That's the difference. Military courtrooms teach you discipline, not fearlessness. People imagine prosecutors are tough people who never shake. The truth is, most of us shake privately. I still remember nights overseas when I couldn't sleep after a hearing involving soldiers barely older than children. Life becomes less black and white as you age. You stop dividing the world into heroes and villains. Mostly, you just find wounded people making poor decisions because they're carrying pain they don't know how to manage. Even Evelyn. She called me unexpectedly a month after the trial. I almost didn't answer. But age teaches you that unfinished bitterness weighs more than a difficult conversation. We met at a diner halfway between Norfolk and the lake. She arrived wearing a simple gray coat, no designer labels, no pearls. She looked ordinary, and somehow, that made her look older. I was angry at Frank for years, she admitted over coffee. He chose you over this family every time. There it was. Not greed, but fear. Fear disguised as control. When he got sick, her voice cracked. I think I panicked. I thought if I controlled the estate, maybe I wouldn't lose him completely. For the first time, I saw the grieving mother beneath the arrogance. It didn't excuse what she had done, but it softened the hatred I felt for her. I loved him too, I said quietly. Tears filled her eyes. I know that now. That sentence meant more than the court ruling. The winter came slowly. I spent my time restoring the things Frank never finished: fixing railings, repainting shutters, organizing the garage. Love leaves fingerprints everywhere. One afternoon, my grandson Caleb found an old military photo in a drawer. "Grandma, is this really you?" The photo showed me at 38, in full dress uniform, sharp posture, dark hair, and eyes that had already seen too much. "Yes," I answered. "You look scary." I laughed harder than I had in months. "Well, sometimes that helped. Mom says you were a colonel. Were you like in the movies?" "No," I said. "Nothing like the movies. Real strength is much quieter than television. Real courage often looks tired, and real integrity rarely announces itself with a shout." A few weeks before Christmas, Judge Bennett sent me a handwritten note. He congratulated me on preserving Frank's wishes and my own dignity. He wrote, "Some people spend their whole lives chasing authority. Very few learn when to carry it quietly." I read that 3 times. That had been my journey. After the military, after the trials, after burying Frank, I didn't want authority. I wanted peace. But life reminded me that peace without self-respect is just surrender. And there is a very important difference between the two. Christmas Eve was cold and clear. I stood on the porch alone after everyone had gone to bed. The lake reflected the moonlight in long silver streaks. For the first time since Frank died, the silence didn't hurt. It comforted me. The courtroom battle wasn't about revenge. It was about memory. It was about protecting love from being rewritten by bitterness. People may underestimate quiet souls. They may mistake kindness for weakness. But dignity has a way of revealing itself when it matters most. If this story meant something to you tonight, perhaps share it with someone who has been underestimated. Leave a comment about a quiet person you know who turned out to be stronger than anyone expected. And if you enjoy stories about resilience and justice, I'd be honored if you stayed for the next one.